Valentine's Day is supposed to be a day of love, happiness, and celebration. Couples exchange gifts, whisper sweet words, and promise each other forever. But for Sandra, Valentine's Day became the day she lost her freedom. It started in the most unexpected way, in a crowded, fancy restaurant, under dim lights and soft music. Sandra sat across from her boyfriend, David, as he smiled too much, his eyes shining with something unreadable. She should have known something was wrong. She should have trusted her instincts. But she didn't. And before she realized it, she had walked into a trap. The restaurant was packed. People chatted, laughed, and enjoyed their meals. Then, suddenly, David clapped his hands, drawing everyone's attention. The room fell silent. Sandra's heart skipped a beat. She watched, confused, as David pushed his chair back and stood up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. And then, in front of everyone, he got down on one knee. Gasps echoed around the restaurant. Some people clapped. Others pulled out their phones, eager to record the moment. Sandra felt her breath hitch. Her hands grew cold. This wasn't happening. David's voice rang through the room. "Sandra, my love, my queen, my everything," he said. His eyes locked onto hers. "From the first moment I met you, I knew you were the one. You complete me. You make me a better man. And today, in front of all these witnesses, I want to ask you one question." He flipped open the box, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" The crowd erupted into cheers. Strangers clapped. The restaurant manager brought out free champagne. But Sandra felt trapped. She didn't want this. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. She hadn't planned for this. She wasn't ready. David had never even hinted at marriage before. But now, with the cameras on her and dozens of eyes watching, she felt like she had no choice. Saying no would humiliate him. It would make her look bad. It would make her seem ungrateful. And so, with a shaky hand and a forced smile, she whispered yes. The restaurant exploded with applause. People hugged her, congratulated her, told her how lucky she was. But inside, Sandra felt like she was drowning. As the applause died down, David slipped the ring onto Sandra's trembling finger. It felt heavy, not just in weight but in meaning. Her throat was dry, her mind screaming at her to stop this, to take back her answer. But how could she? The damage was already done. Cameras flashed. Strangers raised their glasses. Some even wiped tears from their eyes, moved by what they thought was a romantic moment. But Sandra didn't feel romance, she felt panic. David pulled her into a tight embrace. "You've made me the happiest man alive," he whispered into her ear, his grip firm. Too firm. Sandra swallowed hard. She knew she should be happy. David was handsome, successful, and charming at least. That's what everyone else saw. But behind closed doors, things weren't so perfect. He was possessive, controlling. He decided what was best for her, never giving her room to think for herself. And now he had just made the biggest decision of all, marriage. She tried to smile as he kissed her forehead, but inside, she felt trapped. Trapped in a commitment she wasn't ready for. Trapped in a relationship she wasn't sure she even wanted anymore. But it was too late. That night as they drove home, Sandra stared at the ring on her finger. It sparkled under the car's dim light, mocking her. She wanted to take it off, to throw it out the window and pretend none of this had happened. But she couldn't. Instead, she turned to David. "Why didn't you talk to me before proposing?" she asked cautiously. David chuckled, keeping his eyes on the road. "Why? Would you have said no?" Sandra hesitated. "I don't know. I wasn't expecting it." His smile faded. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. "So, you're saying you don't want to marry me?" Sandra's stomach twisted. She had seen this side of him before. The side that demanded obedience, that didn't take no for an answer. Carefully, she chose her words. "I just wish we had talked about it first." David exhaled sharply. "Sandra, I love you. I know what's best for us. You're always overthink things." Sandra pressed her lips together. There it was, the same manipulation. He always made her feel like she was the problem, like she was the one making things difficult. But deep down, she knew the truth. Sandra stared out of the car window, her mind spinning. The city lights blurred as they sped past, but she couldn't focus. All she could hear were David's words. "I know what's best for us." He always said that. He always made decisions without asking her opinion. And now he had done the unthinkable. He had forced her into an engagement she wasn't ready for. David reached over and placed his hand on hers. "You'll see, Sandra. This is the best thing that has ever happened to us." She forced a smile. What else could she do? She felt like she was sinking into a hole she couldn't climb out of. She couldn't disappoint him, not after that grand proposal. Not with the whole world watching. People would call her ungrateful, selfish. But wasn't it selfish for him to pressure her into something so big? Her heart felt heavy as they pulled up to her apartment. As she stepped out of the car, David rolled down the window. "I'll pick you up tomorrow, babe. We have a wedding to plan." Sandra nodded, but as he drove away, she felt like she had just sold her freedom. The next morning, Sandra woke up with a pit in her stomach. She had barely slept. Her phone was flooded with messages, friends congratulating her, family members asking about wedding plans, and even strangers commenting on the viral video of her proposal. Viral. That meant even more pressure. She couldn't back out now. The whole world was watching. A call came in. It was her best friend, Angela. Sandra hesitated before answering. "Congratulations, girl." Angela squealed. "I saw the video. It was so romantic." Sandra forced a laugh. "Yeah, it was unexpected." Angela paused. "Unexpected. Sandra, what's wrong?" Sandra hesitated. She wanted to tell Angela everything. That she felt trapped, that she hadn't been given a choice. But she knew Angela wouldn't understand. No one would. So she just said nothing. "I'm just overwhelmed." Angela giggled. "That's normal. Anyway, I'm coming over. We need to celebrate." Sandra sighed. She didn't feel like celebrating, but she didn't know how to say no. When Angela arrived, she brought a bottle of wine and a dozen wedding magazines. "Let's start planning," she said excitedly, flipping through the glossy pages. Sandra tried to smile. She tried to feel excited, but every time she looked at the engagement ring, her stomach twisted. Angela noticed. "Sandra, do you love David?" Sandra swallowed. "Of course." Angela frowned. "Then why do you look like someone just sentenced you to life in prison?" Sandra forced a laugh. "I'm just nervous. Marriage is a big step." Angela nodded. "Yeah, but it's supposed to feel right." Sandra said nothing. Because it didn't feel right. It felt wrong in every possible way. Just then her phone buzzed. A message from David. "Wear something nice. I'm taking you out tonight." She sighed. Another night of pretending. That evening, David took Sandra to a high-end jewelry store. "We need to pick out wedding bands," he said, pulling her inside. Sandra's heart sank. "David, don't you think we should talk about—" He cut her off. "No need to talk. I've already booked the wedding venue. The date is set." Sandra's mouth fell open. "You set a date. Without asking me." David sighed. "Sandra, stop overthinking. I know what's best for us." Her hands trembled as she looked at him. He wasn't listening. He never listened. And now he was planning her entire future without her input. As they walked out of the store, David's grip on her arm tightened. "Smile," he whispered. "People are watching." Sandra forced a smile. But inside she knew this wasn't love. This was control. Sandra felt like a puppet on strings. Everywhere she turned, David had already made a decision. The wedding venue, the guest list, even the color of her dress, everything was set. And each time she tried to voice her feelings, he dismissed them like they didn't matter. That night, as they sat in his car, she took a deep breath. "David, I don't feel ready for this." His eyes darkened. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I need time. We never talked about marriage before, and I feel like everything is moving too fast." David's jaw tightened. "Sandra, do you think I'd propose if I wasn't sure about us?" "It's not about you, David. It's about me. I need to be sure too." His grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Sandra, you said yes in front of everyone. You can't back out now. Do you know how embarrassing that would be?" Sandra's heart pounded. There it was again, manipulation. Not once had he asked what she wanted. It was always about him. "Just trust me," David said, his voice softer now. "I know what's best for us." Sandra swallowed hard. She was beginning to realize that us really meant him. Days turned into weeks, and Sandra felt more suffocated than ever. David became more possessive, controlling her every move. He decided what she wore, where she went, and even who she spoke to. When she visited Angela, He called her every 10 minutes, demanding to know where she was. "David, I'm just with Angela," she sighed into the phone. "I told you I'd be back soon. And I told you I don't like you hanging around single girls," he snapped. "They'll put ideas in your head." Sandra gritted her teeth. "Angela is my best friend. She's been there for me longer than you have." David's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I am your fiancé, Sandra. That means I come first." Her fingers trembled as she ended the call. Angela gave her a knowing look. "Sandra, this isn't normal. He's controlling you." Sandra exhaled shakily. Deep down, she knew Angela was right. But what was she supposed to do? She had said yes. She had let it go too far. Could she still walk away? Angela took her hands. "You don't have to do this. It's your life." But Sandra wasn't so sure anymore. Sandra lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. Her heart was heavy, her mind racing. Angela's words echoed in her ears. "You don't have to do this. It's your life." But was it really her life anymore? David had taken control of everything. She barely made decisions for herself now. She turned on her side, staring at the engagement ring on her finger. It sparkled under the dim light, a reminder of the trap she was caught in. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a symbol of her prison. Suddenly her phone buzzed. She reached for it, already knowing who it was. David. David said, "I don't like the dress you wore today. It was too tight." Sandra's fingers trembled. She hadn't even sent him a picture. Had he been watching her? Sandra responded, "David, I was with Angela. It wasn't tight." David replied, "You're my fiancé. I don't want other men looking at you. Change how you dress." Sandra felt her throat tighten. She had thought love was supposed to feel warm, safe, and comforting. But with David, it felt like fear. She turned off her phone. But she knew she couldn't turn off her reality. The next morning, David showed up at her apartment unannounced. He was smiling, but his eyes held something else, possession. "I missed you," he said, pulling her into a hug that felt too tight, too forced. Sandra stiffened. "David, you didn't tell me you were coming. Do I need permission to see my fiancé?" He chuckled, but there was no humor in his voice. He walked into her apartment like he owned the place, scanning her surroundings. His eyes landed on a small bag near the door. "Are you going somewhere?" His tone was sharp. Sandra hesitated. "I was thinking of visiting my parents for a few days." David's jaw clenched. "Without telling me?" Sandra took a deep breath. "David, I don't need your permission to see my family." His face darkened. He grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to scare her. "Sandra, you belong to me now. You don't make decisions alone anymore." A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't love. David's grip loosened and he forced a smile. "I just worry about you, babe. The world is dangerous. I need to protect you." Sandra took a step back, her heart racing. "David, I need space. You're suffocating me." His eyes flashed with something unreadable. "Suffocating you." He laughed, shaking his head. "I'm giving you the best life possible. Other women would kill to be in your position." Sandra's stomach twisted. She knew what was coming next. Every time she voiced her feelings, he made her seem ungrateful. "You don't appreciate anything I do for you," David continued, his voice rising. "The proposal, the wedding plans, I've done everything for you, and this is how you thank me." Sandra felt her breath hitch. Everything was about him. "I think you should leave," she said quietly. David's face darkened. For a moment, she thought he would lash out, but then he smiled. "Fine. Have your space." As he walked out, Sandra exhaled shakily. But deep down she knew it wasn't over. For the next few days, David bombarded her with messages. Apologies, love declarations, promises to change. But Sandra wasn't fooled. She had seen his true colors. Then one night, a loud knock echoed through her apartment. Her heart pounded. She checked the time, midnight. She hesitated before opening the door. David stood there, his face unreadable. "David, it's late. I just want to talk," he interrupted, stepping inside before she could stop him. Sandra took a step back, fear creeping up her spine. "You should leave." David's eyes darkened. "Are you breaking up with me?" Sandra swallowed. "I can't do this anymore." For a moment he was silent. Then, in the blink of an eye, his expression changed. Rage filled his face. "You're not leaving me, Sandra," he growled. And before she could react, his hand struck her face. Sandra stumbled back, clutching her cheek. Tears burned in her eyes. David stared at his hand like he couldn't believe what he had done. But instead of apologizing, his face twisted in anger. See what you made me do. Sandra's heart pounded. She needed to get away. Now. The next morning, Sandra packed her bags. She had to leave. If she stayed, it would only get worse. Her hands trembled as she stuffed clothes into a suitcase. But before she could finish, her phone buzzed. David said, "I'm sorry. Please, let's talk." Sandra ignored it, but then another message came. This time, David said, "If you leave me, you'll regret it." A shiver ran down her spine. Then came another from David, "I know where you are. You can't run from me." Sandra's breath hitched. He was watching her. She grabbed her suitcase and bolted out of the apartment. She had to get help. She had to escape. Sandra ran straight to Angela's house. The moment her best friend opened the door, Sandra burst into tears. Angela pulled her inside. What happened? Through sobs, Sandra told her everything. The control, the manipulation, the abuse. Angela's face hardened. "We're going to the police." Sandra hesitated. "What if he comes after me?" Angela gripped her hands. "That's why we have to report him. He won't stop until we make him." Sandra swallowed hard. She was terrified, but she knew Angela was right. For the first time in weeks, she felt hope. At the police station, Sandra told her story. The officers listened carefully, nodding as they took notes. One of them, a kind-looking officer, reassured her. "You did the right thing coming here. We'll make sure he doesn't hurt you again." Sandra exhaled shakily. Then one officer turned to her. "We'll need a restraining order." Sandra nodded. It was the only way to stay safe. As she signed the papers, she realized something. She wasn't weak. She wasn't powerless. For the first time in a long time, Sandra had taken control of her own life. Days later, the police arrested David. His charm didn't save him this time. The evidence was clear. The messages, the threats, everything proved that he was dangerous. Sandra watched from a distance as they took him away. He glared at her, his face full of hate, but she didn't flinch. Angela squeezed her hand. "It's over, Sandra." Sandra let out a deep breath. The wounds on her face would heal. The scars in her heart would take longer. But one thing was certain, she was free. And she had learned a lesson she would never forget. Never let society pressure you into a relationship. Many people suffer in silence, trapped in toxic relationships because of pressure from society. But love is not control. Love is not fear. If you ever feel trapped, remember, you have the power to walk away. No one else can live your life for you. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Storytime with African Tales for part 2 of the story. Until next time, stay safe and choose love, not control.